Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth panel with artists and scholars held in conjunction with Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicanographics, 1965 to now, an exhibition that brings together 5 decades of printmaking by Chicanx artists and their cross-cultural collaborators. I'm E. Carmen Ramos, Acting Chief Curator and Curator of Latinx Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I'm proud to have organized this exhibition and delighted to greet all of you tonight. Thank you for being here. First, we want to gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in Washington, D.C., the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we convene, and the labor of the people who were enslaved in constructing the historic building that is home to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We welcome our viewers to reflect and honor the Native communities in their own region. Tonight's conversation is focused on spirituality and indigeneity within Chicanx art. It goes without saying that for decades, the ancient world, specifically Mesoamerica, has been a source of inspiration for Chicanx and other artists of Mexican descent in the United States. From the inception of the Civil Rights Movement, literature, murals, prints, and manifestos like El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán affirmed indigenous and mestizo identities and instilled a strong indigenous pulse within the Chicano movement, one that is constantly being redefined. Tonight, we feature 2 artists, Irena Cervantes and Enrique Chagoya, who approach indigeneity from political, artistic, and spiritual perspectives through works that are often grounded in careful research and visual quoting of historic works of art. Both artists are deeply committed to the medium of printmaking and in different ways have used the medium to challenge Eurocentric framings of history and culture. They have been active members of Chicano and Latino organizations in California and have a lot of history and wisdom to share with us tonight. I'm really excited to hear them speak. I'm also thrilled that Claudia Zapata, curatorial assistant at SAM, who was a critical member of the curatorial team for this exhibition, is framing and moderating tonight's conversation. Zapata is a doctoral candidate in art history at Southern Methodist University. They received their BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in classic Maya art. Zapata has curated exhibitions at Mexicarte Museum in Austin and other Texas institutions. They have published articles in Panhandle, Plains Historical Review, Jolas, Aztlán, Hemisphere, and El Mundo Surdo 7. Their recent essay, Chicanx Art in the Digital Age, is featured in the catalog for Printing the Revolution. It's a must read, if I do say so myself. Claudia will first share some of her expert reflections on our topic, and will then introduce our panelists, who will each speak about their own trajectory. This will be followed by a discussion, and then I'll rejoin the program and open the floor to audience questions. Please remember to use the question and answer function to submit your queries. So without further ado, thank you for joining us, and I welcome Claudia to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Carmen. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Issues of indigeneity and spirituality are significant and complex through lines in Chicanx art. Conceptually, many artworks featured in Printing the Revolution explore these ideologies through lenses of immigrant activism, indigenous solidarity, Chicano futurism, spiritual reclamations, ritual calendar resurrection, and redefined writing systems. More than iconographic inspiration from the ancient world, Chicanx artists' artworks use ancient Mesoamerican religious imagery as a decolonial effort to challenge Eurocentrism. Their visual and political work supports the autochthonous people and stories that define the landmass some indigenous people refer to as Turtle Island or the Americas. Artists in this exhibition disrupt a Western chronology of time, with ancient and contemporary indigeneity and colonial critiques often intertwined. This pairing indicates a decisive political positionality around central debates of indigenous land rights and diaspora, contesting the European lens and colonization that defines the Americas. This support is prominent in the immigrant rights graphics of the 21st century. Chicano Yaqui artist Ernesto Yreina Montejano and Shepard Fairey created Not One More Deportation as part of a fundraiser for the National Day Laborer Organizing Network and the Not One More activist movement calling for a halt to all deportations. Montejano's featured little girl in the We Are Human bucket hat is a recurring figure in his political graphics. In this version, he features monarch butterflies, the de facto symbol of the immigrant rights movement. These efforts to humanize those affected by government deportation and highlight the paradoxical expulsion of indigenous communities are critical to Chicana and Yaqui artist Esther Hernandez's works. In her 2008 Sunraid print, she revisits her canonical 1982 agribusiness work, Sunmad, to identify indigenous groups' deportation from the US by US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Chicanx prints can also serve as direct financial support for indigenous communities and Native activism. Jesus Barraza and Nancy Pili Hernandez created Indian Land for a 2004 fundraiser for the Peace and Dignity Journey, an indigenous spiritual run across the continent. Posters acted as solidarity and informational hubs to further support a cause. Royal Chicano Air Force Ricardo Favela's 1976 print, Centennial Means 500 Years of Genocide, calls for the release of Russell Redner and Kenneth Loudhawk, American Indian movement activists arrested in 1973 after their participation in a staged protest at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Magu's Cruising Turtle Island conjures a new Chicano world vision of an Americas free of colonization, employing Mesoamerican sign systems, ritual landscape, Chicano lowriders, and futuristic aviation. His Chicano futurist approach, or one that defamiliarizes history and projects a new future using explorations of race, the environment, and technology through a Chicanx lens, creates a speculative map of a decolonial future. Frequently, Chicanx artists used mythic indigenous figures as a form of agency. Yolanda Lopez and Javier Viramontes adapt, quote, warrior figures that recall Mesoamerican elites in royal regalia. There's not an anthropological exactitude to these visual readings. Rather, Chicanx artists use these imagined figures as a visual synecdoche of ancient lineages to serve as inspiration, reflection, and political intimidation. The reclaiming and reimagining of religious icons such as the Virgen de Guadalupe are quintessential to the Chicana artistic practice. Queer Chicana artists challenge conservative leanings that often define Marian devotion and instead proselytize a queer reading. Esther Hernandez evokes the Virgen on her lesbian partner's back in La Ofrenda. Alma Lopez's technologically informed collage Our Lady reconfigures the demure original Virgin scene, as well as reclaims a long-standing ancient myth. She replaces the Virgin's cloak with the upright version of the rebellious Coyolxauhqui. This ancient Mexica figure, sister to the patron god Huitzilopochtli, is famous for her descent and dismemberment on Coatepec, or Snake Mountain, after an attempted murder of their mother, Coatlicue. This mythic figure is part of survivor narratives for contemporary feminist artwork, with artists reconfiguring Coyolxauhqui as an empowered figure combating patriarchal rulership. Mesoamerican monolithic sculptures continually appear throughout Chicanx art. Melanie Cervantes patterns an Osoloto Quashikali, a Mexica religious receptacle for storing the hearts of the sacrificed, as a backdrop to a contemporary danzante, commenting on the resilience of indigenous practices. Luis Gonzalez includes the art of Teotihuacan and a skull sculpture of Mictlantecutli, a death deity to promote Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead. This ever-fluid holiday, usually held on November 1st and 2nd, extracts practices from Roman Catholicism, Latin American popular culture, Mexican printmaking, and the ancient veneration of the dead. Sacramento's RCAF collective also promoted the Fiesta del Maíz, a woman-centered celebration in June highlighting the new harvests and native foodways, honoring the Aztec maize goddess Xulonen. This goddess image comes from the Codex Maglibaciano, a colonial Aztec codex featuring religious practices and deities. These ancient and colonial accordion-style books, or codices, feature calendrics, myths, genealogy, and ritual practices. Such book forms and writing systems are a continual referent for Chicanx artists like Michael Menchaca and Eric Garcia. Each incorporates these readings forms, multivariate layouts, and image-based writing systems to create their own reading practice and lexicon, commenting on historical moments ranging from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to the drug cartel wars. Tonight's featured panelists are two of the most prominent artists working in these themes. Enrique Chagoya is a Mexican-born artist who works in different media such as painting, drawing, multiples, and printmaking. His work juxtaposes secular, popular, and religious symbols from ancient to contemporary sources to address the post-colonial clash between Western and non-Western cultures. He studied at the Escuela Nacional de Economía at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and received degrees from the San Francisco Art Institute and the University of California at Berkeley. Currently, he's a full professor at the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University and has been teaching art practice since 1995. Our first speaker, Yreina D. Cervantes, is a third-generation Chicana currently based in Los Angeles. She works primarily in painting, printmaking, and muralism. Her body of work reflects over 40 years of exploration and the development of an iconography influenced by Mesoamerican mythology and cosmology, Mexican art traditions, Chicanx self-determination, and women's history. She earned a BA in Fine Arts from UC Santa Cruz and an MFA from UCLA. Since 1999, she taught in the Department of Chicano Studies at California State University at Northridge and was appointed Professor Emeritus in 2019. Now I welcome Yreina to the virtual stage.
Okay, I just want to start by saying thank you to Carmen Ramos and Claudia Zapata, and of course Jessica McFadden and Kaylee Bryan, everybody at the Smithsonian that has worked so hard on this exhibition on Printing Revolution. I'm really honored to be a part of it and to be invited to participate in this conversation. I also just want to take a moment to remember and thank my ancestors and everyone that came before. I also want to thank all those teachers, mentors, students, and especially other Chicanx artists that I have learned so much from. I'm going to just go through some of the, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through some of the themes that you will see in my work. I'm not going to go through each slide individually, so I hope that you'll be able to see some of these themes in my work and recognize, and hopefully they'll have some resonance for you. So some of the themes in my work are the spirituality of resistance, decolonizing spirituality, Chicana, Chicanx, Indigenous spirituality, ceremony, ritual, healing, feminine power, divinity, the goddesses, Indigenous worldview and Mesoamerican cosmology, sacred space, the four sacred directions in the center, reciprocity, respect for the earth and natural elements, nature, all living things, and interconnectedness, duality, balance of complementary opposites, embodied memoria, Nepantla, Nahuatl, in the form of the jaguar octopus, and the Dia de los Muertos in terms of reclaimed spirituality. Can I go to the next slide? And this is actually Chicana spirituality in regards to the Chicanx solidarity with Central America and Latin America. But before I start with that, I just want to say a few words about, I think what is really at the heart of Chicanx and indigeneity and spirituality is the desire and pursuit for transformation. And transformation that takes place.
Yreina, it's a little hard to hear you. Are you covering the microphone with possibly papers?
No, not at all.
Right now I can hear you really well.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so what I started to say was at the heart, I believe, of Chicanx spirituality and indigeneity is this desire and pursuit of transformation. Transformation on many levels, of course, personal transformation, the transformation of institutions and a pursuit of social justice. And also, I want to first start by saying that in the one of the ways in which this kind of transformation was really able to take place was through those spaces that provided support, encouragement, resources to, Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx artists at a time when, those resources did not exist. There was very little interest or no interest in the mainstream. And so these spaces became safe spaces, spaces where we could create community, where we could dialogue about the work. And also it really helped us move forward in terms of our personal growth. So for me, I was really fortunate to be a part of Self-Help Graphics, one of those sites of transformation in Los Angeles that really helped to advocate for Chicanx artists very early on. Many times, of course, these organizations, these Chicano arts organizations were initiated by the artists themselves. But in terms of my own personal growth, one of the ways in which I was able to grow was through my understanding of printmaking and specifically serigraphy. So Self-Help Graphics created these ateliers, especially for us to be able to build on our knowledge of printmaking and serigraphy. So I worked at Self-Help Graphics from around 1980 through 85, 86. And I had the opportunity to really develop my interest and my understanding of the possibilities of silkscreen. So that actually coincided with 1983 through the end of the 80s. And this coincided with a really vibrant and important movement within the Chicanx communities. It was a movement of solidarity for struggles in Central America and Latin America, because we realized that, of course, those same imperialistic forces or forces of oppression that were really creating and helping to essentially oppressive peoples in Latin America and Central America were also the same forces that we had to deal with here in different ways. So anyway, I just want to say that throughout my images, you'll see different symbols. And again, I'm not going to talk about each piece, but I just want to say that the jaguar is a recurrent image in all my work. And sometimes the jaguar functions as the nahualito or guardian spirit, animal spirit. It functions as a messenger, as a guide. And in this case, this piece is called Victoria Ocelot, and it's really dedicated to, again, the struggle in Central America. Specifically, this was really inspired by Rigoberta Menchú after seeing a film that she was in called When the Mountains Tremble. And the jaguar here functions as really a symbol of the resilient and unconquerable spirit of the indigenous people. And maybe we can just go through the next slides more quickly. So Camino Largo. Okay, next, please. Just one thing about this particular image, wherever I could in my work, I tried to make those kind of connections between the Chicanx struggle and the struggles of people in Central and Latin America. And this particular piece is called Alerta, and it recurs in some of the different pieces that I do. But it's this image that people may be familiar with of Patsy Tijerina, and these images of the four caminantes, or the four runners, and as a reference to the sacred directions, four directions in the sacred center. Anyway, so these particular images were taken from actual newspaper articles at the time of an immigration raid. And I saw these runners, these people that were trying to escape, and they were running so fast it looked like they were flying. And then again, this is Patsy Tijerina. Alerta. And then this was an installation and performance in collaboration with a different artists and organizations, Central American organizations. It took place at Self-Help Graphics in 1986. Of course, Olga Talamante, who was a political prisoner for her activism and her work in Latin America, and who is still very, very active in the community in the Bay Area today. The Chicanica mural was a collaboration with some of the artists in Managua, Nicaragua, in 1986. The Chicano delegation to Nicaragua. Okay, this next section is immigration, indigenous struggles, nature, and environmental justice. And of course, immigration is so tied to all of those different things in terms of nature, environmental justice, and the economics that are happening in Mexico and Latin America. So this is kind of a bridge between the first, that activism, and immigration. And so this is, of course, the mural La Ofrenda, and it's also a homage to the role that women, the positive role that women play in transformation. And again, you see this, the Caminantes. This is La Ruta Turquesa, which makes a reference to the, over many, many, many thousands of years where people migrated back and forth. Of course, there were no artificial borders. And this is making reference to those kind of migrations back and forth through the Americas. Tierra Firme. And then the protectors of la naturaleza. And this is important too, because in terms of the kinds of work that's being done in activism around social justice and nature is environmental justice. It really impacts the indigenous peoples very directly, because many times it's the indigenous peoples that are leading these kinds of this advocacy and awareness. And this is a homage to Berta Casares, Homero Gomez Gonzalez, and Roy Huguet Martinez Perez. Self-portraits in indigeneity. So portraits in indigeneity. So I selected some of the portraits that speak more directly to in particular to Chicana indigeneity. And Gloria Anzaldúa has a concept, it's called autohistoria, and that autohistoria really represents the idea that the self-portrait goes beyond the individual and that it connects, hopefully, to a larger community, that there's resonance for people when they see and understand, the work. Más allá is again, another self-portrait that's related to my relationship with my mother. There are references here also to Coyolxauhqui and Cuautlicue. And Nepantla, there's been so much work on Nepantla. And of course, I have gratitude to Gloria Anzaldúa for her really explorations and, how she began to really expand the idea of what Nepantla was for Chicanx peoples. I first heard about Nepantla through the writings of Miguel León Portilla and understood at that time that meaning of being in between or torn between. But of course, Gloria expanded that to the idea that Nepantla is a place, again, of transformation, of creativity, of possibility, and inclusion. Big Baby Balam, this piece is dedicated to the elements, and this is making reference to corn, lightning, water. And I was inspired, through the struggles of the peoples in Chiapas in particular, and what was going on with NAFTA, and then as well, just the contamination of GMO maize, and maize, of course, being a staple and the sustenance of indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica. One of the things I appreciate in work is humor, and that's one of the things I have to say I appreciate in Enrique's work, humor and satire. And this is like, I have many conversations with the Nahualito, or Nahualita, and in this case, the conversation is, are you post-Chicana or post-Chicana? or Chicana with an X, or are you post Osiloto or post Jaguar, or perhaps just a tigre of a different stripe? And then, so the next is also a conversation. Again, here I picture myself as a tlacuila or a scribe, and I'm having the conversation with the jaguar in the guise of Tezcatlipoca. This is a symbol of Tezcatlipoca, and Tezcatlipoca, the jaguar is asking me, have you seen my bag of tricks? And I'm asking, have you seen my mojo? This is a representation of a sacred bundle. And again, the symbols for jaguar and scribe. So I think one of the ways that really I came to spirituality and this idea of transformation and reclaiming indigenous spirituality is through Dia de los Muertos. And again, thanks to Self-Help Graphics for really helping me understand the meaning of Dia de los Muertos and the reclamation of that, especially in terms of indigenous tradition. So also in my work in the last 20 years, working with the students was really a big part of it was working with the students who have a really strong tradition at Cal State University Northridge in celebration and honoring of Dia de los Muertos. And so this was I saw this as a very important work, and also kind of an intervention in terms of how we bring those values, those indigenous values, into the institution and really begin to explore them more deeply and further. I had the honor of working with my colleague, Lara Medina. We did work together over the years in many different projects, and a really great respect to my colleagues in the Department of Chicana and Chicana Studies at CSUN, a really progressive department. So we were able we were first of all invited by Alma Cervantes, another Chicana artist and scholar, and she was working at the University of Toowoomba in Australia. So she initiated this invitation for us to come and have an exchange with Aboriginal women there. And so we did this exchange in terms of the different traditions of how we honor and respect our loved ones that have passed. There was great participation from the students and also from two members of the Mujeres de Maíz, Claudia Mercado and Marisa Alvarez, of course, Marta Martinez. And when we got there, we did the ofrendas. Of course, there was an exhibition of the Aboriginal women's art, which was very profound. And then we also, at that time, this was in 2016, Berta Cáceres had just been killed a few months before. So we wanted to honor her. And also, of course, the struggle with Ayotzinapa. And this was actually in preparation. The students at CSUN really helped in terms of our being able to prepare our stencils. I learned actually this particular method of doing stencils from a graduate student that was working with me, Marta Martinez. Diosas y Mujeres, I'm going to get through this very quickly, but Diosas y Mujeres, and see the next. So of course, Frida Kahlo, very early on, of course, by now people are familiar with Frida, but she was really an inspiration for many Chicana artists. This is an image, the heart of the sky, the heart of the earth, making reference to the different goddesses. This is a reference to the goddess of the Teotihuacan. And of course, there's a conversation that's going on. This is a poster from early, functions in terms of women's voices and celebrating women's voices. And of course, an homage to the Mujeres de Juárez. This is a homage to the goddess Tlazolteotl. Generally, she's known as a goddess of, how can I say, she's the confessor of sins, but also the goddess of sensuality. But in her more profound dimensions, she's also the goddess of the sweat lodge or the temescal. She's a goddess of healing. She's also associated with weaving. And so she has many different profound meanings. And she's also, of course, associated with the moon, the different phases of the moon. And last, I wanted to just end with this piece, Mujer de Mucha Nahua. And this was really a homage to the different inspirations of women, in particular in Mexico, the dedication to Comandante Ramona in the Zapatista movement, Rosario Castellanos, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and and again, the image of the goddess. And just to mention, this symbol is a symbol, Mixtic Palamil. It's a Mayan symbol that represents the connection to the umbilical cord to the universe. There's also a Mexica concept, the Tlaxico, that is also the same meaning, our connection to the universe, the umbilical cord of the universe. And the symbol for the goddess, the double heart, and the symbol of the Altepet, which is the symbol of the goddess, of Tonantzin, Coatlicue, etc. So thank you.
I want to thank Claudia, Carmen, Jessica, Kayleg, and all the staff from the Smithsonian for organizing this event. Thank you for having me here. Thank you everybody in the audience for being present to this talk. I'm gonna go kind of fast in most of my work just to save some time. Let me start with the first slide. I moved from Mexico in 1979 to the Bay Area and went to study at San Francisco Art Institute. I wanted to keep studying political economy, but the School of Economics was not as exciting as the School of Economics in Mexico City, where I was able to go to the countryside, work with farm workers, do many things that they were not available here. So I decided to change to art. It was an easy transition since I had been making art since I was a kid. My father is an artist who didn't make a living as an artist, and he taught me how to do sketching and color theory when I was about 7 years old. My dad worked in the central bank in Mexico, which is the Mint, and his job was to catch con artists and forgers, and his office was full of forgeries, things that look alike, that influence my work. I was about 10 years when I first went to his office. And that left a big impression for me. Eventually, I wanted to do look-alike things. So when I went to the Art Institute back in 1981, I was very active at the time when I moved here in solidarity work with Central America. I went to Nicaragua in 1980. I was involved in local committees in San Francisco. And I was still a student, undergraduate at the Art Institute when I was exposed to original Goya's etchings from the disasters of war and the caprichos in my class for history of printmaking. I only knew Goya from books like this one that I bought in Mexico when I lived there, and from the Dover books, editorials. And that's the first time I did my first lookalike. This was back in 1983. And this was the first of many, many etchings I've been doing until today. It was not published until 20 years later by Segura Publishing in Arizona. And this was when Ronald Reagan declared himself to be a Contra. And this etching was perfect because it had the word Contra in it. It's the original title by Goya, Contra el Bien General, or Against the Common Good. The rubber stamp says Museo de Antigüedades Absurdas or Museum of Absurd Antiques. And the symbol, the hand, is what people use in Mexico to call each other moron with a line, a sign language kind of the bad way. Just around the same time, I got involved in an artist call against intervention in Central America, which was organized from New York by art critic Lucy Lippard and poets from El Salvador. And here in the Bay Area, I worked together with other fellow students at the Art Institute, organizing a series of local exhibitions in solidarity. And we raised quite a few $1,000s that we sent to the literacy campaign in Central America. And at the time, I decided to do sort of like an editorial cartoon for the exhibitions. And we have the exhibition at the Art Institute, then at the Mission Cultural Center in the Mission. This was the first charcoal drawing I did, really big. It's 80 by 80 inches. And it got vandalized. After I showed it at the Art Institute, it went to the Mission Cultural Center. And you could see the torn on the side, on the face of Henry Kissinger. So Henry Kissinger went in a commission to Central America and declared that Nicaragua at the time, in the early 80s, was a puppet of the Soviet Union and Cuba. So, but when somebody vandalized my work at the Mission Cultural Center, I decided to make another lookalike. I was feeling really happy trying to make lookalikes, just thinking of a career on forgeries if I need to, but thankfully I didn't, and I got away with making lookalike things until today without being forgeries. I guess that's the influence from my father. From the same times, back in 88, I did When Paradise Arrived, which is my picture of colonialism, the displacement of Native American cultures from the continent, and particularly in the United States, where the constant harassment of Native Americans, as well as people from Mexican descent and Latin American descent, keeps happening in a very exclusionary colonialist culture. And in this drawing in the middle, you won't see it here, but it reads English only, right in the center. This is in the collection of the De Rosa Preserve in Napa Valley. Anyway, so around the same time, in the mid-80s, I began to get involved with the Galería de la Raza, first as a volunteer, eventually as a member of the board of directors. And back in 1986, I was asked to be an interim artistic director right after the late René Yáñez left the Galería. And here I am in one of the benefits we did for the victims of the earthquake in Mexico City. Somebody painted me there. I'm not sure who was the billboard artist. And also right next to me is the late Eva Garcia, who used to do a lot of the billboards in the Galería de la Raza. This is the billboard just outside the gallery. At the gallery, once I began to be organizing exhibitions, I was asked by the board of directors to focus on balancing the history of exhibition of women artists. So the only solo exhibitions that we did in the Galería de la Raza were women artists from the time I started in 1986 through 1990 when I left for a teaching job. During those 3.5 years, the only solo shows I co-curated with the co-curator Sal Garcia, who used to work there. We did exhibitions like one solo show of Esther Hernandez, also another two-person show with Barbara Carrasco, two women show, Barbara Carrasco and Juana Alicia. Then an installation with Yolanda Lopez, which also Sal Garcia work organized, helping her organize the installation. An exhibition of Puerto Rican artist Cristina Emanuel, and an exhibition of Mexican photographer Graciela Iturbide. We did all kinds of exhibitions at the Galeria. This is the poster I designed for the previous benefit. Everything is crooked, like the buildings after an earthquake. With this, with a project with the Movimiento Popular del Pueblo in Mexico City, and we took quite a few $1,000 to benefit the reconstruction of people in downtown, in one of the poorest areas in Mexico City. The photograph was Citlali Rovirosa. This was the first exhibition I organized for the Galeria. I used to teach at the San Francisco County Jail, and I was able to bring artwork from those students of mine at the Galería de la Raza for my first show. And I was able to get my students, the quote unquote, the inmates. I saw them as students, mostly people from Central America and Mexico, some African American students. I was able to bring them free for one day to come to the opening. Thankfully, the sheriff of San Francisco, Sheriff Hennessy, was very progressive, and he let us having there. But some of the major events that the Galeria did was Day of the Dead. The Galeria was one of the very first Chicanx organizations that had been organizing Day of the Dead. They started doing their first Day of the Dead around the time of the second year of their existence. The Galeria opened in 1970. And in 1971, they did, I think, the very first Day of the Dead. The members who created Galería de la Raza were part of the same people who were in Casa Hispana, who in 1979 did a ceremony for Dia de Todos los Santos, which is more like the Spanish Catholic calendar celebration. So the actual very first Day of the Dead in San Francisco was 1971 or 72 at the most. We took Day of the Dead all the way to New York, to the Alternative Museum, in collaboration with Gino Rodriguez. And also helping us was René Castro, who was one of the two members of Mission Gráfica, together with Joe Sánchez. And the two of us took the exhibition to New York. Was the very first time Day of the Dead was organized in New York. That was 1988. The year before, Herminia Albarrán, she was one of my favorite altar makers, together with many other women artists who did incredible altars, like Yolanda, Amalia Mesa Baines and Garfias Wu, who did many other altars. Herminia, to me, was maybe the most self-taught artist among the altar makers. She did everything in this altar, the paper cutouts, all the way covering the roof, the ceiling. She baked her own bread in a bakery right nearby. And so it was, very much a labor of one person show. We brought one of her altars to New York and was the biggest sensation. And we also did a procession in New York back in 1988. As you could see in Herminia's, you could see a picture of one of the founders of Galería de la Raza, Ralph Maradiaga, who unfortunately died fairly young, 52, right, I believe 1985. Sal Garcia did this memorial screen printing of Ralph back in 1988, also published by Mission Gráfica at the Mission Cultural Center. A couple of years after I left the Galeria, I was still hanging around in the Mission with many friends. Here we see the late René Yáñez, his friend Cynthia. In the center, a photographer, Eugenio Castro. In the background, you can see Guillermo Gómez Peña. And other friends right next to Guillermo. There is Andrea, a German jeweler maker, and Josefina, another friend next to me. And Cynthia Vasquez, right next to Guillermo Gómez Peña. So the Galeria was very influential to me to develop my own codices, like Tales of the Conquest from 1992. That's during the quincentenary of Columbus' arrival to the Americas. And I did a mix of drawing and painting together with, photocopy transfers in the same book. Here you could see the Virgin of Guadalupe right next to Coatlicue. And it's a very interesting interaction because the dress of the Virgin of Guadalupe contains the symbol of Coatlicue. What looks like a flower and a stem is not a flower, neither a stem. It's a symbol of a hill, the hill of Tepeyac. And the stem is actually the underground river that runs through that. So this symbolic element was some kind of writing in the painting that indigenous people recognized, and she was an instant hit. Since the Spaniards didn't have much of any luck trying to conquer the spirit of the indigenous people, they were able to commission this one from the artist Marco Zipac. Anyway, these are the last pages of the same book with Don Catarino, which is from a Mexican comic, and Superman here, who's in an American comic, rescuing an immigrant kid from the attacks of other farm workers. But Don Catarino doesn't really quite bite that thing, and he's shooting some kryptonite bullets. On the other side, you see an Aztec artist getting trained with European art making styles, moving away from the style of codices. Another of my codex that I did in 2002 is to protest the sexual abuse of the Catholic Church of children and nuns, at the same time the hypocrisy of being homophobic and against same-sex marriage, and very militant against birth control. And this book got very controversial because I was representing pictures of corruption. That's what I felt corruption was like in the codex. So I mix icons together with soft porn Mexican comics that I found on the street, and this created a huge controversy in 2010 in Colorado, in Loveland, when a member of the Tea Party decided to do a picket line on my work in the museum. And It made it all the way to the news and got destroyed by a fanatic that drove all the way her truck. She was a truck driver. She drove her truck all the way from Montana to Colorado with a crowbar, destroyed the frame and destroyed the book. And I wish somebody had told this lady that this was a multiple original. There were about 39 more copies of this. If anything, she only did that the other copies were a little more expensive later and got a lot of publicity. But also at the end, wasn't a happy end. I ended up being friends with a local pastor who actually, he still were very good friends, but he refused to join the picket line, and he also got threats, etc. But still, till today, will end up in a happy end story. So I'm gonna finish very quickly, just browsing through my work, the different influence I have, critiquing stereotypes by trying to humanize the stereotypes, putting myself as an example of a human being. Maybe I'm not the best example, but it's also part of my DNA. I recently have my DNA tested, and I'm 51% Native American. The rest 38% is Iberian, probably Basque, and the other 10% I'm Jewish, Arabic, South Asian, East Asian, and whatnot. My ancestors were very, very promiscuous. So this is going to be another look-alike print. This is the President's Xenophobic Nightmare. And that's one of the different series that I use to represent my work. Anyway, so I am being asked to end up, and this is it. This is the end of my presentation. This is what I'm working on right now, and the rubber stamp that's going to go on that print. Thank you. Sorry for the little delay. All right, I'm going to stop the share. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. Irena, if you could come back. And just start your video. Great, I see you. Thank you so much. We did it, nailed it. Thank you for your presentations. That was wonderful. And I'm so glad everyone can now see, your great artworks. I'm such a huge fan of both of your bodies of work. So let's start off talking about the writing systems. So you both use ancient writing systems to transform your artwork into a sort of book artistic object. So how do you envision viewers reading your image sequences? And how are you challenging or reinforcing the concept of writing? And let's start off with Enrique.
Sure. I follow very closely. I study the systems of writing pre-Columbian books, and they change from Mayan to a little bit from Mayan Aztec or Mixtec Zapotec. But unfortunately, the references to the original language is lost. Not until lately, they began to decode the Mayan writing. And Mayan writing became actually from symbolic to more phonetic, and then back to symbolic over time. But in general terms, they are more visual forms of writing. And they are very, very precise. They were to be performed by whoever was reading the books, either maybe a priest or a pre-Columbian shaman, or the people who have to talk to communities. Not everybody was literate in the pre-Columbian world, but the connections between images represented specific symbols. And there was a debate whether this was literature or not among linguists not too long ago. And there's a great book put together by Elizabeth Hill Bond. It's called Literacies Without Words. And she claims that many languages that are non-phonetic are equally precise, and we use them today. Languages like, symbolic languages that we use in traffic signs, in airport signs, in musical writing, which is not necessarily phonetic, binary system, mathematics that could be read through different people from different languages. So ancient writing was not too different. And that's the way I use it in my work. Sometimes I use juxtapose the symbology of images that might or might not be decoded by the viewer, because they might not know everything I'm putting on the paper. Even myself, I don't know everything I'm using completely, but there is a symbolic element that interacts to the point that people react, sometimes very, very seriously, very angry when they don't. They rather listen to the interpretation of Fox News than mine, and that's something is difficult to control. But in general terms, it's the perfect style for visual language, where you could put symbolic elements represented by a form, not by a phonetic symbol, but by a form. And when you put them in connection, then you're creating like visual sentences, visual poetry, any way you want to describe it. So that's the way I see language in my at least in my codices.
Great, thank you so much. And Irena?
Okay, well, I think that what really interested me and how I came to have a desire and connection to understand more about the ancient writings is a kind of, again, that pursuit of deeper knowledge, and the values and the knowledge that was imbued in these writings. And so in my work, I've done my best to try and decipher the meanings as best as possible, because the sources are always you have to make sure and look and look again and see that what you are actually trying to understand is a true meaning. And so so again, in my work, I am juxtaposing both different writing systems. Again, as Enrique mentioned, the Mayan, the Mixteca, many of the different codices. I think my exposure to the first codice was when I was in undergraduate school. I was 18 years old, and I bought a book on the Codex Mendoza. And so all the different codices have really informed my work in terms of trying to understand, again, the deeper meaning of what's being said. So if you see my work, and I have to say that there are other artists, that have been doing that in many ways. Santa Barasa, Celia Herrero Rodriguez. Currently, there's younger artists, Margaret, Kika Alarcon, Sandy Rodriguez. Really trying to but to work with those symbols in a way that makes sense in our contemporary reality. So I think that when I'm using those writing symbols, I think part of the question was how are people able to read it? Well, if you look at my work over time, there's a repetition of certain symbols, and I'm hoping that it will encourage people to engage and to be curious about what these things mean, and that they begin to understand the language. And really, I think what we're doing in our work is creating this hybrid language, of Chicanx experience, paying homage to the writing systems of our ancestors that in the past and the present, because this legacy continues. And so I think it's really trying to, again, just to connect to the deeper knowledge of what is being depicted and said in those languages.
Great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my next question. So Chicana feminist scholars such as Claudia Zapata and Chicana visual artists like Irena Cervantes advocate for spiritual activism and rethinking of traditional iconographies like the Virgen de Guadalupe. So what is your approach to reframing spiritual traditions in your art? And let's go back to you, Irena, on this one.
Okay, thank you. I think that, again, when I was saying about talking about at the heart of Chicana spirituality is this idea, and not idea, but the desire for transformation. And for me, I first came to looking at and understanding and trying to understand the different goddesses and gods through my desire to find something that was more meaningful to me in terms of my spirituality. My father was Catholic, my mother was Methodist. I was not brought up in any particular religious tradition, but I I was looking for something that I felt was I could connect to more in terms of some, you know, again, knowledge that was not so patriarchal. And so I came to the Virgen of Guadalupe really through my understanding of the goddesses, because I didn't have that connection with the Virgen of Guadalupe. But I must say, through working with my students, there's such a deep connection and reverence to the Virgen of Guadalupe and her powers. So when we have the conversations in my class in terms of, or my classes in terms of what is, again, the deeper history and meaning of the Virgen of Guadalupe and her connection to Tonantzin and the goddesses, you know, it begins to raise certain questions, right? In terms of their own spirituality and how they can reconcile. Anyhow, so I think that that's what many Chicana artists have been trying to do, is to find this connection in terms of their spirituality, reclaim it, and also make sense of it in our own time.
Thank you. Enrique, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's very much part of the history of colonialism, how spirituality, especially indigenous spirituality, has been a target. I mean, there was, in the conquest, there was not only a genocide, but a culturicide. If many of you might know, the library of Texcoco, where thousands of codices were hosted, was destroyed during the conquest between 1519 and 1521. And that library was created by King Netzahualcoyotl, the Hungry Coyote, who was a poet, who was against human sacrifices himself, something that you don't hear in National Geographic or hardly any Western anthropologist. And he organized festivals of floricanto, of poetry, as well as, you know, architectural. He did a lot of architecture. So thankfully lucky for him, he died just about a few years before Columbus arrived to the continent, but it still was the peak of the Aztec Empire. So that spirituality represented by thousands of books, and you might have to remember the pre-Columbian knowledge, at least of central Mexico, was very much stored in those books. And that was totally destroyed. There is a zero Aztec books that survived the conquest, not a single one. The Aztec books that exist today, they are Aztec books, but they were painted immediately after the conquest. Some of them organized by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, like the Codex Florentino, which I use in my own codex, and many other codices were painted right after. The Codex Florentino, or the Historia de las Nuevas Indias, was a 13-volume codex, narrating all the costumes of the Aztecs. But that was part, because they didn't know who they were conquering. But that was just a little example of the spiritual destruction that happened through the conquest. When the indigenous people saw the burning of the bonfire of the codices, they committed mass suicide. And this is an account by Miguel León Portilla in his book Toltecayotl, or What is Important to Remember or to Preserve. That's the translation. And in that book, he has the testimony of Fernando de Alba Ixtlisochitl, who describes the library, who describes the mass suicide. There is a Codex Ixtlisochitl, by the way, which is a beautiful book, which I use also in my own work. But beyond that, the Spaniards, as I say in my lecture, have a hard time conquering the soul of the indigenous people into Christianity, into Catholicism. And this is very much taboo in Mexico. The fact that the painting of the Virgin Guadalupe was commissioned. And there are scholars saying it, that, and you can find it online, that it was attributed to an amazing Aztec painter whose Christianized name is Marcos Zipac. And Marcos Zipac is attributed with a painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And I saw a movie that is hardly ever, I've never seen it again, in a library in Mexico, where the whole story is narrated. The artist gets in love with the model, and they are married with if they promise that they will disappear, basically. And they disappear. Nobody knows what happens to Marcos and his model. But the Virgin of Guadalupe, as I was saying, has encoded in her dress the symbol of the hill of Tepeyac. That's the symbol of that looks like a flower on her dress. Is actually the Aztec representation of the hill of Tepeyac with a river that characterizes the hill. And until recently, there was running water under the Virgin of Guadalupe's basilica, because that's where they put the Virgin of Guadalupe, and that's basically where Coatlicue was being worshipped. So the connection between Coatlicue and the dress is clear in terms of the pre-Columbian language on the dress of the Virgin. Not only that, she's wearing a black ribbon that represents virgin young women in the Aztec world. She's the mother of the moon and the sun, and the sun is represented by the big halo around the Virgin. The moon is there right on the bottom, and so on. I mean, we could talk a lot about Coatlicue, a lot about the Virgin of Guadalupe. I don't want to take over this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, let's move on to the next question. But thank you. That was great. Marcos Ipac, yeah, he doesn't come up as much as he should. It's still kind of debated though whether he's the original author and creator of the Virgen de Guadalupe, but he's in current sources as possibly one of the artists. Right. So let's talk a little bit about your artistic and research process, because for both of you, there's such a deluge of call outs to sources ranging from literature, popular culture, ancient iconography, and present day politics. So can you walk us through your research process and how you create these temporal connections and thematic conversations in your work? And let's start off with Yreina with this.
Yeah. Well, I think before the research, there was the search that I mentioned before, that search for connection, that search for a decolonizing spirituality. The different influences that led me to this path, of course, was the lived experience of Chicanas and Chicanos trying to reclaim that spirituality from the different kind of ceremonias and rituals that people were beginning to try to incorporate in their lives. You mentioned earlier before the Fiesta de Maíz. Those are some of the earliest ones, at least here in California, that I recall. Connections to Northern Native American Indigenous peoples, attendance and participation in the sweat lodge, in the sun dances, and then of course, the knowledge that came through healing practices, traditional healing practices in our own families that perhaps before we didn't really recognize as being indigenous, and reconnecting to those and reclaiming those. So the research, again, as with Enrique, is informed by, of course, different writings, and I'm trying to have a discerning eye in terms of those writings, because there's sometimes complications in the way that the work is translated, trying to also see if you're working with as much as possible authentic sources. Again, interactions with Native peoples and both in North America and Latin America as much as possible, and has been possible. So also just interactions, there's been many healers, traditional healers, curanderas, particularly the women that have come back and forth, the traditions of danza as well. So there are many different sources besides the literature, and of course Enrique mentioned Nezahualcóyotl, and of course the poetry, all the different poetry and writings of Floricanto that came out at that time. So I think in terms of the research, it's both trying to connect to lived experience, as experience interacting with people, and of course, through the literature and through the scholarship that's out there, and always with a discerning eye, because you really want to move forward with respect in terms of what these knowledge systems are, that it's the intention is not to usurp, but to connect with and pay homage to.
Thank you so much. And Enrique?
Yes, I'm not interested in research as a historian, or and just to, as if I was writing essays. Although sometimes I do that, but more as an artist. I think as an artist you have more freedom than a regular essay. But I do as much as I can the research. But history, as most of you know, is very biased. History has been written by those who win the wars. And then you have to make an extra effort to find the alternative histories or the other histories, the untold histories, not necessarily the alternative. Sometimes the real history is actually the untold histories. So when you research, sometimes you find very biased opinions. And I would say I feel frustrated with a lot of Western anthropologists. That's the very first thing they are talking about is about how the Aztecs were cannibals, committed human sacrifice, as if European countries, European cultures, ancient cultures were not doing that. As if American contemporary culture was not doing that, the human sacrifice especially, with the capital punishment and, what the police does with Black and brown people. So, I mean, there's this kind of colonial versions of history. So as an artist, I realized that from that perspective, history is more an ideological construction than an actual science. So as an artist, we all have our freedom to play with history and invent histories. That almost like what Picasso would say, it's, art is a lie that helps us understand the truth. So that's the difference between, writing a serious book and an essay with quotes and, like verified facts. Who cares? In my books, it's the imaginary conquest of Europe by the Aztecs or the imaginary different elements. It's fiction, but still, it helps us understand and think a very different point of view than the Eurocentric point of view.
Right.
Claudia, could I say one more thing?
Sure.
I meant to make a point. Also, I really want to acknowledge, the learning that's been taking place between the artists themselves in regards to this knowledge, this indigenous knowledge. And in particular, the work of the Chicana feminist writers, of course, Ana Castillo, Sherry Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Amalia Mesa Baines, Sybil Venegas, all these women that have been really instrumental in articulating and giving us a language with which to describe, our connection and our current experience. But also I want to say that I think, in the same parallel to the artists or to the writers have been the artists that have also been shaping and creating this language. And so there's just been the tradition, of course, that is extended, this idea of text and image and literature and the visual. And it continues, today in terms of this kind of relationship between the artists and the writers. So I really just wanted to acknowledge, the current writers and scholars and artists that have really added to this scholarship and to this knowledge, and that I feel grateful to.
Yeah, and your work, you literally put text from these sources in your prints in this kind of lyrical way. So, okay, well, we're going to wrap up now, and now we're going to move on to the Q&A. So if we could get Carmen back.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for such a wonderful conversation. I've been learning so much from hearing the three of you speak. And we've been getting a lot of questions. It's going to be hard to choose which ones to pose to all of you. But there was one question here. It says, I was struck by Enrique Chagoya's discussing his DNA test earlier. Could both artists please comment on your understanding of mestizaje and whether your perspective on this topic has evolved over the course of your career?
Sure.
Oh, Irena, why don't you start?
Well, mestizaje, right? The big M. I think it's really, of course, complicated. there are different discourses in terms of, mestizaje and indigeneity, the Chicanx experience in terms of their connection to indigeneity. I think it's so, there's no simple way to, to really discuss it. I think that we are so, of course, it's not even a question of blood quantum, how much, indigenous blood you have. I think if you look at our communities today, I mean, there's such a range of mestizaje within our culture and our community. You may have somebody that's, has more indigenous blood and is removed from their traditions. You may have somebody that's mixed and is trying to reclaim those traditions. You may have güerita or güerito that, identifies, with these traditions. So it's like, how do you, again, it's like, how do you define, who or what is really justified in terms of claiming their indigeneity. And again, the mestizaje, you do have to recognize that we have all these different influences. But I think the question is also about when you're trying to reclaim that part of your indigenous identity, it's more about the blood quantum. It's about the tradition, the values, the deeper meaning of what is imbued in that knowledge. So it's complicated, I think. I don't know that it will ever really be answered.
Thank you. Enrique?
Yes, well, I think we have to think in terms of what mestizaje is. In Mexico, mestizaje came as a term from the Mexican Revolution. And one of the intellectuals of the idea of mestizaje was Jose Vasconcelos, who wanted to even up the importance of all races in Mexico. Very much following the idea that the mix of different ethnic groups got mixed during colonial times, as you might have seen in the stereotypes played by those casta paintings, if you recall them. Unfortunately, the idea of mestizaje as presented by the Mexican government, and which, by the way, the early years were very indigenous, very much focused on indigenous culture as a source of major national identity in Mexico, were very progressive. And the same thing with the muralist movement, focus on indigenismo and also mestizaje. Unfortunately, the idea of mestizaje ignored the importance of many other cultures besides indigenous and Spaniard. And particularly Mexico has been influenced by many waves of immigration. There is Chinese Mexican, there is Japanese Mexican, there is Jewish Mexican, there is Arabic Mexican, and most important, there is African Mexican that were totally erased with the idea of mestizaje. You don't see them. I mean, right now there is a big renaissance in Mexico trying to rescue the importance of the African Mexican heritage, which you could see it in music, like in Veracruz, the La Bamba, for instance, the kind of music that you play in La Bamba, it's very much influenced for African Mexican cultures. There is African Mexican culture in Oaxaca as well, which has been very much ignored by the idea of mestizaje. So the idea of mestizaje didn't end the system of inequality in Mexico. There is still a great deal of racism, especially of people of color, indigenous people, but also indigenous people who got mixed with African, Afro-Mexican cultures. And also the idea of the conquest is very much related to slavery, because with the extermination of indigenous cultures, which were 90% of the indigenous population in the continent, 90% was gone within the first 100 years after the conquest. So that was a big genocide to start with. That's what brought slavery to the continent, to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to Peru, to Mexico, and finally to the US. So today is very complex. The idea of mestizaje is difficult to define. What's the meaning of a hybrid culture when you still have castes? We have castes not only in Mexico, here, like the book by Isabel Wilkerson, It's a term that's still evolving, I think, and maybe it's the history of the world. And when I talk about my own genes, for instance, I see that my genes get along with each other in my blood. If they didn't, I would be dead. So if my Spanish genes were fighting with my indigenous genes and Jewish and Arabic genes that I have, I mean, Asian, and different genders, because it's probably in my past there's men and women, so that's why I have like cross-gender representations. All of that, I would be dead if they didn't get along. My genes didn't get along, and our genes, most of us have many genes from different sources. So it's the history of the world, and we carry it with ourselves. Identity is a different thing. Being ourselves identify as Chicanx or Mexicanx or a mix of it, or Mexican American, or it's mostly a political statement in a way, depending how you are raised. And I cannot say I'm an indigenous background person, even though my indigenous genes are the majority, just because I was raised in an indigenous culture. I don't speak Nahua, which is probably my heritage. So things get evolving, I would say, in terms of the meaning of mestizaje. But I mean, again, another time we could be having a whole meeting about it.
Okay. We've been asking a lot of artists who've participated in this conversation series about the impact of COVID on your practice, and what have you been doing, during this period of isolation. That was a question that was posed by one of our audience members. I was wondering, Irena, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah. When talking about transformation and transition, I feel like this has really been a great period of transition and hopefully transformation. It coincided with my retirement as an instructor at CSUN, and also just with certain concerns I had about my health. And so this has just been this time, again, for many people, a time of isolation, not necessarily loneliness, isolation, but reflection, trying to understand what priorities are, working towards developing more work. So I think that it just kind of coincided with many different changes that were happening, for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I look forward to really being able to process everything, come through and have that inspiration to create more work after 20 years of teaching full-time as an instructor, coming back to my art practice in a more dynamic way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enrique?
What
was the question again? I'm sorry, I got distracted with
Okay. It was just a question about COVID. How has this period impacted your work? What are the projects that you're working on during this period?
For me, it was a moment of reflection and production of a small work, because I didn't have access to my studio at the university. So I work for all this time in my dining table. But I did a solo show with small works. I show only one of my 7 deadly sins. I didn't show my most recent codex. So I was very, very active at home. But the most important, I think, for me, was a moment of reflection about what we are doing in the world. How are we we're becoming a threat to the whole planet. And the fact that we got a pandemic going on, it's a proof that we have been messing up too much with wildlife. The things are coming out of destroying the Amazons. The Zika virus, for instance, came from that. The abuse of hunting animals and eating them like the bats. That's where the COVID came from. And not to mention all the fires that we have in California that were very horrific in the fall last year, and we're afraid of what's coming up. all of that makes me think we really need to follow, in a way, follow the indigenous people who had a better interaction with nature. They lived thousands of years without putting in danger the planet. So Mother Earth is giving us a big, big punishment for not listening to her. So we should be more in tune. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have just a couple more questions because we're all coming to the end of our program. And I'm going to give you a choice of which question each of you wants to answer. So a big part of this exhibition is focusing on mentorship networks that exist within our exhibition itself, right? We know that, Irena, you have, inspired artists in our exhibition. Someone like Fabiana Rodriguez, for example, who was your student. And so that's one question, sort of if you could just talk just briefly about mentorship in your career. And the other option is both of you are artists of color in academia. And I was wondering if you could, talk about your experience as a professor of color in academia. So choose one.
I really would like to answer both, but I think I'll talk about being an artist of color in academia. I think part of what's happening right now is there are many Chicanx artists that are really working in terms of not just transforming, but really trying to, work within the institution and create, programming and opportunities for students that really, again, are looking at Indigenous values as well as part of other ways of knowing. I think being an artist of color in the institution, particularly in the academia, has been difficult, especially in the arts. In the arts, people consider that the art departments are progressive, but they're really, if you look and see the representation of artists of color, they're some of the most conservative, as you know. So I think it's really been a challenge. Thank God that I worked in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, because it created a place and space for me not to be able to justify or convince about my aesthetics or the work that I was doing or wanted to do, but really created that space and support to be able to do that. So I think it's still very challenging. Thank God we have a lot of very wonderful, artists now in terms of, having the degrees and the MFAs. But the thing is that there's not the spaces that are open for them. And so I think that that's really important. So bringing these changes and these transformations to the institution is always a challenge.
Thank you. Thank you, Irena. That was very thoughtful.
And from a perspective, I think that both questions are related. I think mentorship and academia go together. I've been lucky to be able to participate in some changes at the university, particularly the Institute for Diversity in the Arts, that have brought many artists, Native Americans, artists of color, transgender, and it has been an important experience for myself. Still, there is a lot of things to change. A particular place like Stanford that has a big history that needs to be reckoned with. The founder of the university, Leland Stanford, had very white supremacist statements when he was running for a campaign back in the late 1800s, saying that the Western culture was the most important Western culture in the world. Not to mention that the university hired cheap labor from mostly Chinese workers in the early 20th century, and that the land is formerly Ohlone, indigenous land. So all of these have been acknowledged by the university. Thankfully, thanks to many artists of color in the university, things are moving on, and the university is open to change, which is really wonderful. It's some place where we could influence change. But for me, the most important change is outside of academia, is in the real world. And that's how I see my role. It's more important to be outside than in academia. It's important to work in academia as well because of the mentorship, but then we don't change the world with just more education, more art. We change the world as civic activists, people who act outside the university, hopefully creating bridges and dialogues about different changes that need to happen among many different communities and groups. That's my perspective.
Thank you so much, Enrique and Irena, for this discussion. One of the best parts of this series is that it's recorded. So we have it for history and for other people to view it in the future. I want to thank you both for being part of this program. I want to thank Claudia Zapata for moderating this program and also for being such an important member of the organization of organizing this project. So I really want to thank them for their critical role. I want to thank all of our SAM family members, Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, Bridget and Carlos Parada for also helping us behind the scenes. And I just want to remind everyone that we have one more event as part of the Printing the Revolution conversation series, Creating in a Digital Sphere on May 13th. And we'll be joined by artists Michael Menchaca and Julio Salgado, and Claudia Zapata will also moderate that event. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. See you next time.